The most dangerous predators in our world do not always hide in the dark shadows of remote alleys. Instead, they often sit directly next to us, offering a polite smile or a firm handshake. They move through our neighborhoods and workplaces behind a perfectly crafted mask of sanity, appearing so normal that those around them remain completely oblivious to the cold, calculating monster living just beneath the surface. This is the reality of the abyss, where the line between a civilized neighbor and a predatory killer is thinner than anyone cares to admit. To step into this world and survive, one cannot rely on traditional ideas of human decency or empathy. A chilling tactical blueprint, born from the experience of the FBI, makes it clear that trying to appeal to a killer's better nature is not only useless but potentially a death sentence. To these individuals, a conscience is not a virtue, it is a sign of weakness to be exploited. The only way to truly penetrate their defenses is to weaponize their own twisted nature against them. It is a game of psychological mirrors where the investigator must become what the predator desires or respects. Consider the case of a killer like John Wayne Gacy. To reach him, the typical investigative approach of cold questioning fails. Instead, the strategy requires playing directly to his repressed sexual identity and his desperate need to see himself in a hypermacho light. If the approach had been framed by someone posing as an attractive young man, perhaps using a fabricated photograph to bait his ego, the walls might have crumbled much sooner. It is about understanding the specific hunger of the individual and feeding it until they let their guard down. This methodology extends even to the tactile details of a letter. For a predator like John Robinson, who views himself with the vanity of a high-powered executive, a standard interrogation or a plain government envelope would never suffice. To lure him into a dialogue, the investigator uses expensive, heavy stationery and a splash of high-end masculine cologne. The scent and the feel of the paper act as a multisensory trigger, making the killer feel as though he is finally corresponding with a professional peer who matches his self-perceived status. In this world, Chanel perfume or a specific brand of tobacco can be more effective than a badge, especially when dealing with those obsessed with class and social standing. Maintaining this level of contact with the abyss comes with a heavy price. The correspondence that flows back from behind prison walls reveals a level of detachment that is difficult for the average person to comprehend. These are letters where the most horrific acts are buried between mundane observations. Michael Sams writes casually about watching a football match or how easy it is to bypass prison security, treating his surroundings with total indifference. Joanne Dennehy uses her ink to complain about the supposed lies being told about her, showing a complete lack of remorse for her actions. Ronald DeFeo Jr. reacts with aggressive entitlement, lashing out because he was kept waiting, as if his time were more valuable than the lives he destroyed. There is a terrifying arrogance in these messages. Harvey Carrigan goes as far as to issue veiled threats, letting it be known that he is aware of the investigator's home address and the specific car he drives. Yet, despite these dangers, the method of playing to their ego works. A veteran detective once noted that this approach could open a killer's mind as easily as a tin of beans, slicing through the layers of deception that had previously fooled even the most seasoned psychiatrists. While the experts are often blinded by the mask of normalcy the killers wear, the investigative eye sees the void behind it. The failure to see this void has led to catastrophic systemic collapses. The psychiatric system has, time and again, fallen for the performance of the reformed monster. Paul Beecham provides a harrowing example of this failure. While held at Broadmoor, he managed to convince highly trained experts that he had found love and was a changed man. They saw a success story, but they were actually looking at a master manipulator at work. Believing their own diagnosis, they granted him his freedom, only for him to immediately prove them wrong by committing a predictable and fatal act of violence against the very person who had supported him. The system is equally vulnerable to the legal and religious manipulations of people like Kenneth Bianchi. Known as the Hillside Strangler, he pivoted from a life of horrific violence to a life of calculated litigation and religious posturing. He managed to convince religious figures of his newfound faith, even becoming an ordained minister, all while aggressively suing others for copyright infringement. These individuals understand the rules of society perfectly. They simply choose to use those rules as tools for their own benefit, mocking the institutions designed to contain them. But what drives this internal engine of destruction? Sometimes, the answer is found in the cold, hard clockwork of biology. There are those who can be described as human time bombs, individuals whose very chemistry is a recipe for disaster. Arthur Shawcross was one such case. Inside his body, toxic levels of cryptopyrrole created a condition known as pyroluria, which led to massive, uncontrollable mood swings and sudden bursts of lethal rage. For people like Shawcross, the amygdala and the frontal lobe are in a state of constant conflict, meaning the parts of the brain meant to regulate emotion are simply overwhelmed by a biological glitch. This neurological reality explains the red mist, a state where logic is completely bypassed by a chemical surge of violence. However, understanding the biology of a psychopath does not excuse the horror they inflict. It merely describes the mechanism. Even with these internal malfunctions, the mask remains. Dr. Harold Shipman lived as a trusted community doctor, a man people went to for healing, while he was secretly ending the lives of hundreds of his patients. The San Bernardino shooters lived as a seemingly normal family, hiding their radicalized intent until the moment they struck. They understand the laws of the land, they just believe they are exempt from them. This leads to a crucial and terrifying distinction between the clinical psychopath and the savage. While a psychopath might point to a chemical imbalance or a neurological defect as the source of their behavior, the savage has no such clinical shield. A savage is defined by a willful rejection of social order. They are individuals who are not ignorant of the rules of good behavior, they simply choose to neglect them in favor of brutal, unnecessary violence. Consider the actions of Oscar Pistorius, who fired hollow-point bullets through a locked door without a single warning. This was not a calculated defensive move but an act driven by a deep-seated rage, a manifestation of a personality that allows internal anger to override every human instinct for caution or restraint. Then there is Melanie Maguire, who drugged and dismembered her husband, showing a depraved disregard for the most basic moral boundaries for her own selfish ends. Or John Jr. Robinson, who abandoned every law of society to engage in a life of murder and forgery. These individuals demonstrate that the savage is perhaps the most terrifying predator of all. Unlike the animal that kills for survival, the human savage kills because they have decided that their own desires or their own anger are more important than the lives of others. They are not broken machines. They are conscious actors who have looked at the rules of civilization and decided to step outside of them. The somber reality is that the savage represents the ultimate threshold of evil. Their brutality is not a mistake, nor is it always a product of a diseased mind. It is a conscious, willful choice. They walk among us, fully aware of the pain they cause, choosing to remain monsters because they find power in the abyss. When the mask of sanity finally slips, we are left with the chilling realization that the person we thought we knew was never there at all. There was only the cold, calculating intent of a predator who chose to be a savage. The transition from a polite socialite to a cold-blooded killer is often invisible, hidden behind a mask so seamless it can persist even in the face of the gallows. Neville Heath remains the ultimate example of this terrifying composure, a charming, former military officer who maintained his gentlemanly facade until his very last breath. Moments before his execution for the brutal slaying of 2 women, he stood before the hangman and calmly requested a double brandy, facing his end with the same cocky, unshakable detachment he had used to lure his victims. To understand how such a man can exist, one must look to the diagnostic tools that attempt to map the geography of a monster. The gold standard for this remains the 20-point checklist developed by Professor Robert Hare, a diagnostic ruler designed to measure the specific traits that define the predatory mind. It is a list that reads like a blueprint for a nightmare: glibness, a grandiose sense of self-worth, a history of pathological lying, and, most crucially, a total, chilling lack of empathy or remorse. These individuals possess no internal moral break. While some become the killers whose names we whisper in horror, many others use these same traits to climb the social and professional ladder. They are the ruthless leaders in boardrooms, the manipulative politicians, and the cold-eyed military commanders, who hide their nature behind the prestige of high-ranking positions, moving through society as successful predators in plain sight. The danger of failing to recognize this mask is not merely academic, it is often a matter of life and death. The psychiatric profession, frequently criticized for its fragmented and sometimes overly optimistic assessments, has a history of being fooled by the very monsters it seeks to treat. This fairy-tale approach to rehabilitation led to the profound tragedy of Paul Beecham. After a history of extreme family violence, Beecham was confined to the secure wards of Broadmoor Hospital. There, he performed the role of a reformed man with such conviction that he won over the hospital's medical superintendent, Dr. McGrath. He even manipulated a well-meaning visitor named Rita Riddlesworth into believing he had found redemption through love. Despite the warnings of his past, the system deemed him safe and opened the gates. The performance ended in a predictable bloodbath. Shortly after his release, Beecham murdered Rita, burying her beneath a patio before taking his own life. It was a stark, final reminder that for the psychopath, change is often just another layer of the mask. Even when the mask is not refined, it can be effective through sheer, calculated persistence. Peter Sutcliffe, the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was not a victim of divine command, despite his elaborate claims to the contrary. For years, he maintained a ruse that the voice of God had directed his hand, a calculated lie designed to secure him a stay in the relatively comfortable, cushy environment of a psychiatric hospital rather than the harsh, unforgiving reality of a maximum security prison. He played the part of the paranoid schizophrenic with precision, fooling the shrinks just as he intended. It was only later, through private admissions and the observations of those closest to him, that the truth emerged. His divine mission was a carefully constructed fraud, a tool used to manipulate the system one last time. This lethal combination of ego and manipulation is perhaps most evident in the case of Kenneth Bianchi. To understand Bianchi is to understand the volatile internal seesaw of the aggressive narcissist. On one side sits the God complex, a grandiose version of himself that felt entitled to the highest levels of status and power. This was the man who forged diplomas to set up a fake psychology practice, playing at being a respected professional despite having no legitimate qualifications. On the other side sits the crushing reality of the devalued self, the man who was a failure in the real world, rejected by the police force and unable to maintain a stable life. When these two worlds collided, the result was catastrophic violence. Bianchi used murder as a tool to reclaim the sense of superiority that his real life denied him. However, his most famous attempt at manipulation was the invention of Steve Walker, a supposed alternate personality he claimed was responsible for his crimes. He hoped this performance would allow him to escape the death penalty by claiming a fractured mind. This was not the clinical reality of a split mind, but a calculated lie designed to manipulate the system one last time. The facade only crumbled when an expert investigator tricked him into inventing a third personality on the spot, proving that the entire performance was a work of fiction. Bianchi wasn't a man with a broken mind, he was a man with a bruised ego who used deception as a weapon. The transition from narcissistic entitlement to savagery is perfectly illustrated in the fall of the world-famous athlete, Oscar Pistorius. Once a symbol of human triumph, he became the face of a different kind of horror on Valentine's Day 2013. The scene was a locked bathroom in his high-security home, where he fired 4 black Talon hollow-point bullets, ammunition designed to expand upon impact and cause maximum tissue damage, through the door, killing his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp. In the courtroom, the world watched a performance of a different sort. Pistorius traded his image of the invincible athlete for that of a vulnerable, sobbing man. His legal team leaned heavily on a defense of generalized anxiety, painting him as a man paralyzed by fear who acted instinctively against a perceived intruder. Yet, behind the high-pitched tears in the witness stand, another reality existed. While he presented a picture of frailty to the public, reports from his time in custody suggested the lingering presence of an arrogant elite, someone more concerned with the quality of prison recreational programs than the gravity of his actions. The reality was not one of clinical psychopathy or paralyzing fear, but of a specific kind of internal explosion known as intermittent explosive disorder. This is the red mist of the savage, a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage that overrides every rule of social conduct. When his ego was bruised, perhaps by the simple reality of a relationship conflict, the athlete's self-control evaporated. He did not act out of a biological defect that removed his choice, he surrendered to a moment of lethal, narcissistic fury. The legal system initially struggled with this distinction, handing down a lesser charge of culpable homicide based on his emotional performance. However, the higher courts eventually saw through the anxiety defense. They recognized the legal principle of dolus eventualus, the fact that any person firing high-velocity, expanding bullets through a small, locked door knows that whoever is on the other side will likely die. The conviction was upgraded to murder, reinforcing a final, somber truth, whether hidden behind a gentleman's brandy, a fake diploma, or an athlete's tears, the choice to act as a savage eventually meets its reckoning in the cold light of the law. The most effective camouflage in the world is not found in the wild, but in the sterile hallways of hospitals, the quiet consultation rooms of family doctors, and the prestigious corridors of Ivy League universities. This is the trusted mask, a shield of professional credentials and societal status that allows a predator to move among the vulnerable without ever drawing a second glance. When a person is draped in the authority of a white coat or an advanced degree, the public tends to suspend its natural instincts for caution, creating a hunting ground where the monster is protected by the very institutions designed to provide care. Perhaps no one wore this mask with more devastating success than Harold Shipman. Known to his community as Dr. Fred, he was the image of the saintly, tweed-wearing family physician, a man so respected that he even appeared on television to offer medical advice. Yet, beneath this veneer of the dedicated healer lay a shadow that had been lengthening since his youth. At 17, Shipman stood by his mother's bed and watched her succumb to lung cancer. He didn't just witness her death, he was mesmerized by the process, specifically by the way her physician used morphine to ease her transition from agonizing pain into a terminal, chemical peace. This moment became a lethal blueprint. The needle, once a tool for mercy, became his chosen instrument for murder. As a general practitioner, Shipman developed a profound God complex, an aggressive narcissism that allowed him to oscillate between two distinct identities. To his colleagues and subordinates, he was often seen as an abrasive, arrogant bully who tolerated no dissent. But to the elderly patients who sat in his exam room, he was the personification of compassion. This psychological splitting allowed him to maintain his license to kill for nearly 3 decades. Even an early career scandal involving forged prescriptions and an addiction to opioids couldn't stop him. He simply manipulated his way back into practice, eventually settling in the town of Hyde. There, during routine home visits, he began administering lethal doses of diamorphine, clinical heroin, to patients who trusted him with their lives. Shipman's downfall was not a result of a guilty conscience or a subconscious desire to be stopped. Instead, it was the supreme hubris of a man who believed his intellect placed him above the laws of ordinary men. In a move of staggering arrogance, he murdered a wealthy patient, Kathleen Grundy, and attempted to forge her will to benefit himself. He performed this forgery on a manual typewriter, leaving a forensic trail so clumsy it stood in stark contrast to his carefully maintained professional image. Even after his conviction for 15 murder counts, though the true number likely exceeded 200, Shipman refused to grant the state the satisfaction of his submission. In 2004, he committed suicide in his prison cell, a final, cold act of control intended to deny any external authority over his life or his secrets. While Shipman utilized the authority of a doctor, Melanie Maguire, the Ice Queen, used the refined image of a professional nurse to hide a heart of pure savagery. Maguire did not suffer from a biological glitch. She made a calculated, brutal choice that her husband was an obstacle to be removed so she could pursue an affair with a high-status partner. Her methodology was visceral and efficient. She drugged her husband with a sedative, shot him, and then used her medical knowledge to dismember his body. She packed the remains into 3 matching Kenneth Cole suitcases before discarding them in the Chesapeake Bay, believing her status and refined life would protect her from suspicion. To break through Maguire's icy exterior, the investigator had to speak her language, the language of class and vanity. Knowing she viewed herself as intellectually superior to her fellow inmates, the author reached out using tactical stationery, heavy, cream-colored paper, sealed with wax and lightly sprayed with Chanel perfume. This multisensory lure was designed to massage her ego, making her feel as though she were corresponding with a social and intellectual peer rather than a criminal investigator. The bait worked. In her letters, Maguire's emotional void was chillingly apparent. She wrote long, bitter complaints about the unrefined and unkempt nature of the women around her in prison, yet she never once mentioned the children she had left behind or expressed a shred of remorse for the man she had butchered. However, the Ice Queen was not as clever as she believed. The digital trail she left behind, Google searches for sedative dosages and pharmacy records linking her to the murder tools, shattered her performance. When the weight of this evidence was brought to bear, her refined mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated into a defensive, pathological rage. She was revealed not as a mastermind, but as a savage who had discarded the most basic human rules for the sake of her own convenience. If Maguire was a savage hiding in a nurse's uniform, Michael Bruce Ross was the ultimate psychopathic chess master. With an Ivy League education and an IQ of 150, Ross looked like the all-American boy, but he viewed the entire legal system as an intellectual game he intended to win. Following his arrest for a series of sadistic rapes and murders, Ross made the high-profile decision to volunteer for the death penalty. To the public, it looked like a moment of ultimate remorse, but in reality, it was a power play. By demanding his own execution, he paralyzed the Connecticut judiciary and ensured that he, not the state, controlled the narrative and the timing of his end. Ross's case also served as a grim confirmation that psychopathy is an incurable state of being. While on death row, he participated in an experimental program involving chemical castration, a medical attempt to cure his violent impulses. The experiment was a total failure, proving that no amount of chemical intervention can rewrite the internal landscape of a predator who finds genuine satisfaction in the mechanics of violence. The glitch in his mind was not something that could be smoothed over with a pill, it was the foundation of his identity. The high-tension climax of Ross's story occurred during a filmed interview where the investigator turned the tables on the self-proclaimed genius. By confronting Ross with unreleased police files, the author caught him in a trap, forcing him to confess to the unsolved murders of 2 women at Cornell University. As the mask fell, the description of his crimes became mechanical and cold. He detailed how he had murdered 2 14-year-old schoolgirls, admitting with a flat, terrifying honesty that he had killed the second girl simply to release the tension that the first murder had failed to satisfy. The most haunting moment of the encounter came at the very end. After describing acts of unimaginable cruelty, Ross leaned back and laughed. He called himself a nice guy, a final, mocking display of a master manipulator who knew exactly how much he had taken from the world, and found the irony of his civilized mask to be a joke. He remained a player of games until the moment of his lethal injection in 2005, leaving behind a legacy of shattered lives and a chilling reminder of the void that exists behind the Ivy League smile. These cases demonstrate a somber truth: the predator does not always look like the monster of our nightmares. Sometimes, they look like the doctor we trust with our health, the nurse we expect to provide care, or the brilliant student with a promising future. Behind these masks of medicine, nursing, and academia, the predator remains a conscious, willful actor. Whether it is the narcissistic hubris of a doctor with a needle, the calculated savagery of a wife with a suitcase, or the intellectual games of a killer with a high IQ, the choice to destroy remains their own. They use our trust as a weapon, proving that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we never think to fear. The most dangerous moment for a manipulator is not when they are caught, but the precise second they realize their performance is being picked apart by someone who knows their script better than they do. For the predator who relies on a con, life is a perpetual gamble, a high-stakes puppet show where the audience's belief is the only thing keeping the gallows at bay. When that belief withers under the gaze of a focused psychological counterattack, the mask of sanity does not simply slip, it shatters into 1,000 irreconcilable pieces. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi, the man known as the Conman Supremo, believed he was the ultimate director of such a show. His confidence was not unearned. He had spent a lifetime successfully navigating the world through deception. Long before he and his cousin terrorized Los Angeles, Bianchi had manipulated his way into professional circles, even going so far as to establish a fake psychiatric practice using forged credentials. He understood the language of the mind, or at least the Hollywood version of it, and he intended to use that knowledge to escape the death penalty. Following his arrest, Bianchi embarked on his most ambitious campaign, feigning a fractured psyche. He studied the tropes of multiple personalities, constructing a legal shield in the form of a violent, sneering alter ego named Steve Walker. Under the soft light of hypnosis, he played the part to perfection, casually confessing to horrific stranglings while his host persona remained supposedly oblivious. He almost succeeded. Eminent experts were initially duped, believing they were witnessing a genuine dissociative reaction born of childhood trauma. But the savage had not accounted for the brilliance of Dr. Martin Orne. Recognizing the performative nature of Bianchi's behavior, Orne set a psychological trap that relied on Bianchi's own vanity. Orne casually mentioned that true cases of multiple personalities usually involved at least 3 distinct identities. Eager to perfect his role and please the expert, Bianchi's mind immediately produced a third persona named Billy. The final blow was a masterstroke of forensic theater. Orne asked the Billy persona to interact with a lawyer who wasn't actually in the room. When Bianchi was caught enthusiastically shaking hands with a hallucination, just as his real attorney walked through the door, the charade was over. Exposed as a lucid, manipulative conman, Bianchi was forced to abandon his greatest lie and plead guilty just to save his own life. While Bianchi was a conman of the intellect, Arthur Art John Shawcross was a human time bomb of pure, physical aggression. Known as the monster of the rivers, the 250-pound predator had already been released by a system blinded by his performance as a model prisoner. Once free, he embarked on a secondary, even more brutal killing spree. To extract a long-buried confession from such a man, the investigator had to transition from a listener into a psychological combatant, engaging in a high-stakes exercise in mind control. The landscape of Shawcross's mind was a bizarre mixture of psychopathic vanity and sudden, murderous rage. He had managed to convince a naive girlfriend, Clara, that he was a perfect gentleman, a persona he guarded with obsessive intensity. He was so committed to this image that he even suggested the author act as the best man at his upcoming prison wedding. During a volatile interview, the atmosphere turned lethal when Shawcross erupted. Rather than retreating, the investigator utilized a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. He invaded Shawcross's physical space, standing toe-to-toe with the monster. The counterattack was not physical, but moral. By invoking Clara's name and warning the killer that his gentleman persona would be permanently ruined if he continued to lie about his victims, the investigator flipped a switch. The shift was instantaneous. Desperate to maintain his status in the author's eyes, the predator collapsed into a confession. He admitted on camera to the murder of a 10-year-old boy, delivering a flat, mechanical apology that was devoid of genuine remorse but served as a tactical performance to regain his good standing. It was a cold, calculated transaction that provided a final, somber peace to a grieving mother, leaving Shawcross furious only when he realized he had been outmaneuvered by the very best man ruse he had initiated. If Shawcross was the blunt force of psychopathy, John Cannan was the personification of the suave predator. He was a very British monster who hid a profound, misogynistic savagery behind a veneer of upper-class sophistication. Cannan was a man of tailored suits and expensive champagne, falsely claiming aristocratic lineage to mask a nature that viewed women as disposable objects. In his mind, he was a gentleman of high status. In reality, he was a cold-blooded savage who carried a rape kit in his luxury BMW. The investigation into Cannan revealed what can be described as a devolutionary scale. Every narcissistic injury he suffered, every time a woman rejected him or his fragile ego was bruised, acted as a fuse for escalating violence. He didn't just snap, he devolved. He moved from stalking and assault to abduction and murder, each act a desperate attempt to reclaim the sense of superiority his real life could not provide. He was a moral bigot who believed his external trappings of wealth made him untouchable. To strip away this mask, the investigator employed marketing psychology, appealing directly to Cannan's obsession with luxury and status. By engaging him in a detailed discussion about high-end vehicles, the investigator tricked Cannan into revealing specific details about a red Ford Sierra he had driven years earlier. This forensic bait led the police to DNA evidence linking him to high-profile disappearances, including the case of Susie Lampler. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a fake license plate in Cannan's possession. The letters served as a psychopathic taunt, a hidden trophy that linked him to the identity and location of his victim. Even as he was sentenced to life, Cannan maintained his gentlemanly facade, a testament to the persistence of the savage's vanity. He remained a man who believed that if he dressed the part and spoke with the right accent, the world would ignore the blood on his hands. But as these cases prove, the art of the con has a shelf life. Whether it is the elaborate roleplay of a fake psychologist, the explosive rage of a river monster, or the polished arrogance of a social climber, every predator eventually encounters a psychological countermeasure they cannot manipulate. The high-stakes chess match between the investigator and the predator reveals a final, sobering truth. The Mask of Sanity is a formidable tool, but it is also a prison of the predator's own making. By understanding the specific vanities and triggers of these individuals, whether it is the need to be seen as a genius, a gentleman, or a nice guy, the investigator can turn the predator's own weapons against them. Behind the luxury cars, the best man invitations, and the hallucinated handshakes, there is only a void. And in the end, even the most suave mask or the most aggressive physical threat cannot withstand the weight of the truth when it is applied with focused, psychological precision. The con eventually fails, the performance ends, and the predator is left standing alone in the cold light of justice. The ultimate failure of a civilized society occurs when the very systems designed to protect the innocent instead become a production line for tragedy. This is the dark reality of the Texas killing machine, a period of administrative incompetence that allowed a monster to walk free not once, but twice. Kenneth Allen MacDuff, known as Big Mac, was a man of immense physical power and a complete moral vacuum. His history of violence began with the infamous broomstick murders, a crime of such visceral cruelty that it originally earned him a seat on death row. He had executed teenage boys and committed unspeakable acts against a young woman, yet through a series of legal shifts and prison overcrowding, the gate was left unlatched. In a decision that remains one of the most staggering blunders in judicial history, the parole board labeled this career predator as someone unlikely to kill again. They were catastrophically wrong. Upon his release, MacDuff immediately returned to his hunting grounds, using a technical college as a base to abduct and murder marginalized women across state lines. He treated human life with less regard than a disposable commodity, and the bureaucracy that freed him became an unwitting accomplice to at least 14 more deaths. To break the silence of this brutish killer, the investigator had to understand that MacDuff's only loyalties were to his own greed and his protective mother. Recognizing that a direct appeal for information would be ignored, the author set a honey trap involving a $500 bribe. By ensuring that MacDuff's mother was the one to sign for the funds, the investigator bypassed the killer's natural suspicion. Believing he had successfully conned the system for one last payout, MacDuff finally revealed the location of a missing girl's remains. He was eventually executed, but his legacy remained a grim monument to the blood spilled when a system chooses bureaucratic convenience over public safety. While MacDuff was a predator of blunt force, John Jr. Robinson was the CEO of The Abyss, a man who transformed the savage impulse into a corporate enterprise. To the people of Kansas City, he was a pillar of the community, an Eagle Scout, a man of the year, and a philanthropist. Yet, behind this carefully curated image of success, Robinson was a sadosexual predator who viewed murder as a business transaction. He moved through the early frontiers of the internet, luring victims with promises of employment or romance, only to end their lives and store their remains in 55-gallon steel barrels. These industrial drums, left to sit in storage lockers, contained the only evidence of a life dedicated to the commercialization of depravity. Robinson's lack of empathy extended even to his own bloodline. In a display of familial exploitation that borders on the unbelievable, he murdered a young mother and then sold her kidnapped infant to his own brother and sister-in-law. He framed the transaction as a legitimate adoption, charging his family $5,000 for a child he had essentially stolen from a fresh grave. This was a man who could sit at a family dinner knowing the history of the child across the table, feeling only the satisfaction of a profitable deal. Unmasking the Man of the Year required a sophisticated psychological sting. Working alongside the FBI, the investigator baited Robinson with the promise of a lucrative, fake book deal. Even from the confines of a high-security cell, Robinson's narcissistic need for control was his undoing. He demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a bogus investigation that he claimed would clear his name, proving that the corporate mask never truly comes off. When the ruse was exposed, the polished executive dissolved into an impotent, pathological rage. He remains behind bars, still holding the locations of other victims as his final, desperate bargaining chips in a game of power that only he is still playing. The most chilling realization of this journey into the evil mind is that these monsters often wear the faces society loves the most. Fame and charity are the ultimate camouflage, a biological shield that blinds the public to the predator in their midst. In the tailpiece of this investigation, the names of national treasures like Jimmy Savile emerge as the ultimate warning. Savile raised millions for charity and was faked by royalty and the media, yet this public adoration was the very thing that granted him unfettered access to hundreds of vulnerable victims in hospitals and secure wards. Because he appeared to do good, society's natural defenses were deactivated. We are conditioned to trust those who make us laugh or who provide for the needy, allowing predators to hunt in the open for decades, protected by the very institutions they represent. This leads to the final, urgent warning: the existence of the bubble world. Human beings are biologically wired for social cohesion. Our brains are naturally inclined to look for the good in others because, for most of human history, trust was the glue that kept the tribe together. Psychopaths and savages understand this. They view our empathy not as a virtue, but as a software exploit, a weakness they can use to bypass our internal alarms. They thrive in the blind spots of our biological wiring. While diagnostic checklists are useful for clinicians, they offer little protection for the average person in the real world. The red flags are often quiet: a need for unreasonable control, a history of small, pathological lies, or a lack of genuine warmth that is covered by a high-gloss performance of charm. The author emphasizes that a true psychopath is an incurable reality, and a savage is a person who has made a conscious choice to reject the rules of humanity. They cannot be tamed, and they cannot be taught to feel. The only defense is to recognize the patterns early and sever ties before the mask is fully discarded. The fragility of the line between the protector and the predator is perhaps best captured in a final, unsettling moment from the investigator's own experience. During a visit to a psychiatric facility, a simple case of mistaken identity led to the author being briefly detained as a patient. In those moments of confusion, the polished credentials and the professional status meant nothing. It was a harrowing reminder of how easily the world can shift, and how thin the barrier is between the one who observes the madness and the one who is consumed by it. In a world of carefully constructed masks, the truth is often the only thing more dangerous than the lie. We live in a society that desperately wants to believe in the fairy tale of rehabilitation and the inherent goodness of all people. But as the stories of Macduff, Robinson, and Savile prove, the abyss does not care for our fairy tales. It is populated by individuals who see our bubble world and wait for the moment to burst it. The investigation concludes not with a sense of closure, but with a somber call to vigilance. The predators are still there, sitting in the boardrooms, walking the hospital wings, and smiling from the television screens. They are waiting for us to blink, counting on our biological instinct to trust, and hoping we never look closely enough to see the hollow void behind the mask.